Assignment 4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues in Sport and Exercise Science Research. Origins of Ethics in Research. The Code of Conduct wasn't invented prior to 1947 with the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code saw some amendments in 1964 with the Declaration of Helsinki. Unfortunately, prisoners were forced into subjectivity against their will during the Second World War, and a large part of this was down to the Nazi Party. Among the thousands of appalling acts that the Nazis committed during World War II, one of the most undecorated were the chains of medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Unfortunately, up to around 200,000 victims died during the Second World War due to human experimentation by the Nazis. The euthanasia program began with targeting children under the age of 3 that appeared to show evidence signs of mental or physical retardation. This happened up to 2 years before the Holocaust began. The Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code has 10 stages to it, the first being voluntary consent. This means that voluntary, well-informed, understanding consent of the human subject is required in a full legal capacity before the testing may begin. The second stage is that the test may aim for constructive outcomes, which means that the experiment should always aim for positive results for society that cannot be procured in some other way. The third step is that the testing must be done based on previous knowledge or based on the results from animal experiments, which means that an expectation must be derived from animal experiments or other testing which justifies the experiment occurring. The fourth step is that the experiment should be set up in a way that avoids unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injuries. The fifth step is that the experiment should be set up in a way that avoids unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injuries. The sixth step is that the risk of experiments should be in proportion to the expected humanitarian benefits, so the test should not take place if the benefits are not worth it. The seventh step is that preparations and facilities must be provided with adequate care that protect the subjects against the experiment's risks. The eighth step is that the staff that conduct or take part in the experiment must be fully trained and scientifically qualified. And the ninth step is that the human subjects must be free to immediately quit the experiment at any point when they feel physically or mentally unable to go on. And the 10th step is similarly to the humans in the testing, the medical staff must stop the experiment at any point when they observe that continuation would be dangerous. The Declaration of Helsinki. This is regarded as the foundation document on human research ethics. Related to physicians, the principle of the declaration is to respect for the individual, to promote and safeguard the health, well-being, and rights of participants. Also, the main aim is to understand the causes, developments, and effects of diseases, and to improve preventative diagnostic and therapeutic inventions. Significant theorists. Significant theorists are quite important in this subject, and the two we'll be looking at today are Milgram and Zimbardo. Milgram's obedience experiment took place in 1961. And according to the text, Milgram was interested in the determinants of obedience. This is, the factors that influence people to follow orders given by an authority. Milgram's study consisted of this: 3 male participants. One man would be the teacher and the other man would be the learner. The third man was the experimenter and was always wearing a white coat so that he looked official. However, unbeknownst to the other participant, the learner was always the same man and knew what was really going on. The learner was an older man and the teacher was told that he had heart problems. The experimenter told the 2 men how the study would be done, and then they proceeded along with it. What the experimenter told them was that one man would be the teacher and the other man would be the learner. The teacher would ask the learner a series of word pairs to test his memory. If the learner got one wrong, the teacher would then administer a shock. Every time the learner got a question wrong, the shock voltage would increase. The shock voltage went from 15 to 450, with 450 being the most deadly. However, what Milgram was really testing was how far the teacher would go with the shocks when he started hearing fake screams from the learner whilst administering a shock, and then being told by the experimenter in the white coat to keep going with the experiment. Since the experimenter had the coat on, he looked superior and half the men would go on with what they were being told to do, and keep increasing the shock voltage, even though he could hear the learner crying out in pain. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. The purpose of this was to gain insight into the behavior of prisoners and guards in a real prison. The volunteers were tested psychologically, so much so that some prisoners reacted with extreme psychological emotions and that they were removed from the study within 5 days as a result of this. The issues came from this, where Zimbardo had to end the study early due to the participants suffering with physical and emotional pain. Many things about this study raised ethical issues, and the main issue was that participants were lied to about what they were taking part in. As a researcher, it was Milgram's job to invent an experiment where his hypotheses could be tested, but also where participants would be informed of what they were taking part in. This leads to the unethical issue that this experiment caused most of the participants extreme distress, which was an indirect result of them being lied to about the experiment. Another unethical issue was the usage of Yale's name in the experiment, since Yale had no involvement. The fact that they used Yale's campus and the Yale name on the flyers for them is also unethical, since the article stated that Yale had no hand in the experiment, so this was probably used as a safeguard should the experiment go wrong. BASES. BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences and is also known to be referred to as BASES. BASES awards accreditation to researchers if you fulfilled certain requirements. If a researcher is accredited by BASES, you become valued to them. Ethical and legal issues. Ethical clearance means that researchers must gain ethical clearance from an ethics committee or appropriate body before conducting a study. An ethics committee is an organization that looks at the project proposal to say whether it's safe and ethical. If they agree to the ethics clearance, the project can start. When conducting research, you must ensure that you're working ethically and legally. One of the things you must do before collecting research is getting ethical clearance to enable you to do the things that you need to do to start your research. Benefits analysis. Prior to research commencing, the researcher must ensure that benefits outweigh the risks, as social, physical, or psychological harm may not be permitted. Volunteers. Researchers must ensure participants volunteer for such experiments. They can be paid or receive incentives, but must not be coerced. A participant must consent just for the money, or they may consent just for the money. However, they must be aware of the implications. And if they're not aware of the implications, they are unaware of the risks that they could be in for, which shouldn't be the case. Informed consent. A researcher must receive informed consent from the participant by signing a disclaimer, as this ensures the participant understands and is willing to participate in the study. An informed consent documentation should include personal information about the participant. It should give the participant the right to withdraw at any time, and it should state the results are being stored with confidentiality, including the description of procedures, and including a statement ensuring the study involves research and is being conducted by experienced researchers. The right to withdraw. It is a concept used in research allowing participants to end participation in that study at any time during or after it has been completed, for whatever reason. Health and medical screening questionnaire. The researchers must be informed about the medical state of the participant, and if anything were to happen, the researcher should be aware of the conditions and hopefully be able to solve the issue. Participant disclaimers. There is something that must be signed by the participant if the researcher becomes ill or injured because of the participant not following instructions, then they have to take full responsibility for it. Equality and impartiality. The researcher is expected to be objective and neutral when it comes to encouraging participants, so they must not be biased, but be mindful towards race, age, and gender, for example. Research responsibility. The researcher must protect the participant from any harm before, during, and after the study, handle data with respect and confidentiality, and be competent, ensuring the study is constantly being monitored by someone. Deception. The intentional withholding of information or presentation of deliberately misleading information to a participant. There are two types of deception: omission, meaning passive deception, and commission, meaning actively misleading. Brief and debrief. Participants should be briefed before the study to ensure they know what it is they're doing and are not shocked with any expected situations during the study. Debriefing reduces the risk of harm to the participants. It informs the participants of aims, results, use of data, any deception during the study. However, participants are still able to withdraw from the study after it's completed. Health and safety. The Health and Safety Executive promoted a 5-step approach to researchers. Firstly, they must identify hazards and who and how they are at risk. However, once they have evaluated the risks, they must provide adequate control measures, record significant findings, and review assessment and revise if necessary. Confidentiality and anonymity. This must be taken into account as researchers have a duty of care towards participants. The risks of exposure of results during the study could lead to social and psychological harm, as participants may feel embarrassed, especially if others are around and data is shared. Data collected should be locked in a filing cabinet or on a password-protected computer by the researcher and their supervisor. Data protection. Data the researchers collect is protected under the Data Protection Act. Data can only be shared if the participant gives informed consent on this. As with everything, there are consequences of inadequate care. These include ethical training, prison sentences, reprimand or suspension, physical harm, emotional harm, fines, professional or research credibility, or being stripped of basis accreditation. If a researcher or practitioner reproduces bad practice, doesn't follow the code of conduct, or causes harm or breaks the law in most cases during a study, possible consequences may be given. Some can be as simple as ethical training, where the researcher refines awareness and revises their understanding of how studies should be taken, or others can be serious as prison sentences if the researcher causes serious harm to participants, for example. If the researcher was a lecturer, for example, they could be suspended and will not be able to continue with further research. Other consequences include physical or emotional harm, fines, professional or research credibility, and being stripped of basis accreditation, meaning they have lost their role in research. Scenario 1. An experienced researcher is investigating the difference in levels of muscular hypertrophy between two newcomers to bodybuilding. The experiment was to take place over an 8-week period, and both the participants were to perform the exact same bodybuilding regimes alongside the same nutritional diet, the only difference being that one of the participants would be using human growth hormone supplements and the other would be performing the regime completely naturally. Due to medical dosage reasons, neither participants would be able to remove themselves from the experiment unless they suffered a debilitating injury. Both clients signed a consent form stating these terms prior to the test's inception. What was good about the study was the researcher ensured the participants had filled in a full consent form before the beginning of the experiment. The researcher didn't complete a medical screening questionnaire on his participants, meaning if a participant had a previous injury, the researcher would be unsure of how the injury, if anything, happened. Specifically, if the participant had an asthma attack during the study and the researcher didn't know where the inhaler was, or didn't have a spare one, or isn't medically trained, this could cause physical injury, social injury, or psychological harm to the participant, especially if it's in front of peers. Also, one of the participants would be using growth hormones to aid their muscular growth, which could have extremely negative impacts on their bodies and general health. The participants were misled into the experiment by getting them to sign a consent form which prevented them from dropping out if they wanted to. This is a human rights violation that was basically avoided by clever wording. Scenario 2. A researcher was comparing the flexibility of two groups of young gymnasts to measure the effectiveness of dynamic stretching versus static stretching. However, the researcher forced the participants to stretch for a specific amount of time without telling them beforehand. The participants began to struggle, but they were told this is paramount that they suffer the pain and continue with the experiment. The researcher ensured that the participants were volunteers. They weren't forced into completing the study and had informed consent from their parents or guardians, meaning the carers understood what the study was about. However, the researcher didn't give the participants the right to withdraw by forcing the participants to continue stretching and not telling them how long for. It's deception by omission. Stretching for too long may have caused physical harm to the participants. They were told to deal with the pain and could not stop, even if they wanted to. Scenario 3. A study to determine whether deception of a substance increases the performance of athletes. Before the test, the subject's 1-rep max weights were taken in bench press, squat, and deadlift. Before completing a maximal intensity powerlifting routine, the group are given a placebo sugar pill. Half of the group are told that this is a performance enhancer. The other half are not told whatsoever how this tablet will affect them. The researcher did ensure that participants completed a health and medical screening questionnaire. It was especially needed as the participants were completing high-intensity routines and were given unknown substances. Furthermore, the researchers showed professional conduct throughout, respecting the participants' interests, respecting the confidentiality, and providing any important information about health and safety. However, the researcher did use deception by commission, as he did not tell the participants what the substance was or what it would do. Not telling may be part of the study, however it could lead to psychological harm as the participants may be anxious about what it will do to them. Also, as the researcher told them it showed a positive effect, the participants may have been expecting this, and thus could be disappointed. A participant may have been struggling with the maximum intensity routine, as it wasn't told how long it was or the complexity of it, so this may have led to physical or psychological harm, as they could have become embarrassed about not being able to do it, or to try too hard on a skill that they haven't been taught correctly and injure themselves.